A wounded Navy SEAL came home with nothing but an old truck, a broken heart, and a retired K-9 who still woke up, ready to protect him. Everyone laughed when he inherited a forgotten valley of cold stone, dead roads, and land no one wanted. But that night, when the dog growled at a crack in the mountain and warm air breathed from beneath the frozen rock, the veteran realized God had not led him there by accident. Beneath the place the town called Useless was a miracle waiting to be found, a truth powerful men tried to bury, and a second chance for a man who thought his life was already over. If you believe God can use even a scarred dog to lead a wounded soul back home, comment Amen. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, loyalty, courage, and redemption. Hartwell Falls, North Carolina, woke beneath a cold, late autumn fog that rolled down from the Blue Ridge Mountains and rested over the wooden rooftops, the church steeple, the diner windows, and the narrow streets where wet maple leaves stuck to the tires of passing trucks. Ethan Walker drove into town just after 8, his old dark green Silverado moving slowly past the courthouse square, as if the town itself were studying him through every window. Ethan was 41, tall, broad-shouldered, and controlled in the way only men trained for dangerous silence could be, with short, dark hair touched by gray near the temples, a rough beard along his jaw, steel blue eyes that checked exits before faces, and the quiet weight of a former Navy SEAL who had survived places he rarely named. Beside him sat Ranger, an 8-year-old retired K-9 German Shepherd, sable black and brown with a whitening muzzle, amber eyes, a scar across his nose, and the calm alertness of a dog who had once worked war zones beside Ethan, finding danger before men knew danger was there. The law office of Harold Bennett stood between a closed hardware store and an old barber shop, its brass handle worn smooth by decades of families coming in to hear what the dead had left behind. Harold Bennett was 72, thin, careful, silver-haired, and soft-spoken, the kind of old attorney who had learned that a sentence could divide brothers faster than any fence line. He greeted Ethan with a restrained handshake, glanced once at Ranger, then led them into a conference room that smelled of paper, lemon polish, damp coats, and old coffee. At the table sat Martin and Denise Walker, distant cousins Ethan barely remembered, both dressed in black but watching the folders more than the floor. Martin was heavy-set, red-faced, and restless, a man who seemed more comfortable pricing equipment than offering sympathy, while Denise was narrow, pale, polished, and sharp-eyed, her purse held tightly in both hands as if grief might steal from her. Samuel Walker's name settled over the room when Harold opened the file. Samuel had been Ethan's uncle, a former miner and survey hand who had spent most of his later life alone in the high country west of town, a lean old man with a white beard, hard hands, and a reputation for talking about water under stone until people stopped inviting him to explain. Ethan remembered him as stubborn, distant, and difficult, but not cruel. Samuel had never been warm with words, yet he had once taught Ethan how to read a slope, how to notice wind moving through rock, and how land that looked dead could still be holding something alive beneath it. Harold read the will in a slow legal voice, while fog pressed against the window glass. Martin and Denise received Samuel's remaining savings, his truck title, storage tools, and several pieces of equipment worth selling. Ethan sat still, one hand near Ranger's collar, while Ranger lay beneath the table with his eyes open. Then Harold turned to the final page and paused. "To my nephew, Ethan Walker," he read. "I leave Cedar Hollow Valley, 43 recorded acres, west of Hartwell Falls, including surface access, timber remnants, spring rights where applicable, and all existing structures, known or unknown." The silence that followed was not respectful. It was thin, awkward, almost amused. Everyone in Hartwell Falls knew Cedar Hollow, or thought they did. It was broken mountain land, steep red clay, moss-covered stone, collapsed logging paths, bad drainage, and black rock shelves where survey stakes disappeared after winter storms. Martin leaned back and muttered, "That place is a sinkhole with trees." Denise lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Ethan did not answer, because long ago he had learned that the first careless comment in a room often told the truth faster than a confession. When the cousins left, Harold did not move. He waited until the hallway grew quiet, then closed the conference room door. The professional calm on his face faded into something older and more troubled. From a drawer, he removed a piece of red flannel and unfolded it on the table, revealing a heavy iron key dark with age and a hand-drawn map creased soft from years of being opened and closed. "Samuel told me to give you these privately," Harold said, lowering his voice. "Only if you came in person. Only if Ranger was still with you." Ethan looked up slowly. Ranger rose from the floor without command and stared at the key, nose twitching once, then twice, as though some buried scent in the metal had reached him through rust, cloth, and time. Ethan picked up the key. It felt cold and heavier than it should have. Before Ethan could ask what it opened, the front bell chimed, and Caleb Whitmore entered as if he owned the room before anyone introduced him. Caleb was 48, tall, polished, and handsome in the careful way wealthy men become when money helps them resist aging. His charcoal coat fit perfectly. His brown hair was swept back with silver at the sides, and his smile carried warmth that never quite reached his eyes. He represented Summit Ridge Development, a company that had been buying tired orchards, old farms, and mountain parcels around Hartwell Falls for 3 years, promising renewal while quiet families packed their lives into trailers and left. "Ethan Walker," Caleb said, offering his hand. "Sorry about Samuel, complicated man, but he knew these mountains." Ethan shook once and felt no grief in the grip. Ranger gave a low warning sound from deep in his chest, not loud, but clear enough that Harold looked down. "I heard Cedar Hollow pass to you." Caleb continued smoothly. "That land can become a burden fast, especially for someone not planning to stay. Taxes, erosion liability, old access disputes, all of it adds up. Summit Ridge would be willing to take it off your hands before it becomes trouble." Ethan studied him with the same patience he had once used on roads overseas, where smiling men stood too close to danger. "You make offers before coffee in this town?" Ethan asked. Caleb laughed softly. "Only when I can help." Ethan had less than $400, no steady home, and a truck that sounded tired every morning. But Ranger's growl, Samuel's secret instructions, and Caleb's timing made the shape of the room feel wrong. "I'll look at it first," Ethan said. Caleb's smile stayed in place, but his eyes cooled. "Of course. Just don't wait too long." Land like that gets worse when ignored. By noon, the fog had thinned, and Ethan stopped at Hartwell Diner for coffee and water for Ranger. The diner was narrow and warm, with cracked red booths, old Little League photos, and a pie case glowing near the counter. Maggie Carter moved behind the register with tired grace and steady hands. She was 36, slender, auburn-haired, brown-eyed, and practical. A nurse and young widow who had stayed in Hartwell Falls after her husband died in a winter highway accident, choosing to raise her son and keep the small free clinic alive even when the town could barely fund it. Her son, Noah, sat near the window with homework open, a 10-year-old boy with sandy hair, pale skin, narrow shoulders, and serious eyes. His blue inhaler lying beside his elbow, like a quiet rule his body had written for him. When the door opened and cold air swept through the diner, Noah's breathing tightened. It began as a small cough, then a shallow struggle he tried to hide. Maggie turned instantly, but Ranger moved first. The old German shepherd crossed the floor slowly and sat between Noah and the draft, his broad body blocking the cold, his head lowered, his eyes soft and steady. Noah stared at him, distracted from panic by the calm animal in front of him, while Maggie guided his breathing in a low voice. After a minute, the boy's shoulders eased. Maggie looked at Ranger, then at Ethan. "He knew," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "He usually does." Noah touched Ranger's fur with 2 careful fingers and whispered, "Was he a soldier dog?" Ethan looked at the white on Ranger's muzzle. He was. "Now he's family." Maggie sat with Ethan only a few minutes, but she spoke like someone giving a warning, not gossip. She told him Summit Ridge had been buying land around town and pressuring families who could not afford lawyers, and that Cedar Hollow had suddenly become interesting to men who used to laugh at it. She said the clinic might close if the remaining community parcels were taken. Ethan listened without promising anything, because promises had become expensive after war, but something in him shifted when she spoke of people being pushed off land they did not know how to defend. Outside, Caleb's black SUV passed slowly by the diner window, too slow for traffic, too deliberate to ignore. Ranger lifted his head without making a sound. Late that afternoon, Ethan drove west with Ranger beside him, and Cedar Hollow waiting beneath a steel-gray sky. The paved road became gravel, then red clay, then a broken logging track, where branches scraped the truck doors and fog gathered between the pines. The valley appeared like a place the world had given up on. Steep slopes, moss-black rock, twisted trees, dead leaves trapped in drainage cuts, and wind moving through timber with a hollow voice. Ethan parked near a collapsed wooden gate and stepped into cold air that cut through his jacket. For a moment, he saw only what everyone else saw: useless land, bad access, no power, no cabin, no reason to stay. Then Ranger moved past him, nose low, body tense, following something Ethan could not smell. The dog climbed toward a moss-covered seam in the rocks, stopped suddenly, growled low, and backed away one careful step. Ethan crouched, pushed wet leaves aside, and found a narrow crack in the stone. From inside the mountain, against the freezing breath of evening, a thin current of warm air touched his hand, and Ethan stayed very still while Ranger watched the dark opening as if something beneath Cedar Hollow had been waiting for them. Ethan did not leave Cedar Hollow that evening, though every practical thing in the valley told him he should, because the sky had gone dark early behind the Blue Ridge ridgeline. The air had sharpened until frost began silvering the dead leaves around the truck tires, and the broken logging road behind him looked worse in twilight than it had in daylight. He set his temporary camp below a leaning pine not far from the collapsed gate, where a shelf of black stone cut the wind enough to keep the tarp from snapping loose, and he worked with quiet military efficiency, laying out a bedroll, hanging a small lantern from a branch, checking the old rope, the flashlight batteries, the field knife, the first aid kit, and the worn canvas pack that had followed him through more bad places than most men would ever admit. Ranger watched the slope instead of the camp. The old German shepherd stood with his front paws slightly apart, his sable coat lifting in the mountain wind, ears aimed toward the moss-covered rock seam where the warm air had touched Ethan's hand. And every few minutes the dog's nose moved as if he were reading a message written in the dark. Ethan heated coffee over a small burner, took one swallow, and felt the bitter warmth hit his empty stomach. But he kept looking back at Ranger, because after years of working with that dog overseas, he knew the difference between curiosity and warning, and Ranger was not curious. The night came down slowly, not with silence but with mountain sound, the creak of trees, the soft fall of wet leaves, the distant rush of water somewhere below the valley floor, and now and then the hollow movement of air through stone that might have been wind if Ethan had not already felt heat coming from the crack. He lay inside the bedroll with his boots still on, and Ranger positioned at the tarp entrance, facing outward, the way he always did, never sleeping with his back to open ground, never truly retired from the work that had shaped him. Ethan closed his eyes, but sleep stayed shallow. In the dark, a branch snapped somewhere uphill, and his hand moved toward the flashlight before his mind caught up. Ranger lifted his head, but did not bark, only listened. The dog's calm held Ethan in place, the same way it had held him after nights overseas when sound arrived before memory, and memory arrived before breath. Near midnight, Ranger stood, walked 10 steps toward the slope, then stopped and stared at the hidden seam in the rock until Ethan finally rose and whispered, "Tomorrow," though the dog did not look convinced. Morning opened in Cedar Hollow, under a low ceiling of gray cloud and pale fog, with the valley floor wet from frost melt and the pine trunks shining black where the cold had settled into the bark. Ethan moved before sunrise had fully cleared the ridge, because waiting made the old instincts restless, and by 7:20, he had the climbing rope anchored around the thick base of a mountain laurel, twisted hard into the stone. He wore his faded field jacket, gloves, headlamp, and the compact harness he had kept after leaving active duty, not because he expected to need it again, but because men like him rarely threw away anything that had once kept them alive. Ranger stood near the crack, tense but obedient, while Ethan cleared wet leaves and moss from the stone with one gloved hand. The opening was narrow, angled downward, and easy to miss from 10 feet away. It looked like nothing a sensible man would crawl into. Ethan clipped the rope to his harness, tested the anchor 3 times, then gave Ranger a firm look. "Stay." Ranger's ears shifted, and Ethan knew the dog understood, which did not mean the dog agreed. The first 10 feet were tight, cold, and sharp-edged, the rock scraping Ethan's shoulders while loose gravel clicked down into darkness below him. But around 15 feet, the air changed. It lost the bite of the morning, grew damp and warmer, carrying a smell of wet mineral stone, rust, and old underground water. Ethan descended slowly, one boot searching below the other, the flashlight beam sliding over black rock, until the narrow shaft widened and dropped him into a natural chamber, nearly 30 feet below the surface. He landed on solid stone, breathed once, and swept the light in a slow circle. The chamber was larger than he expected, maybe 25 feet across, with a low curved ceiling, dark basalt walls slick with moisture, and a narrow stream running through the floor in a channel cut by time. But what made him still was not the water. It was the evidence of hands. Iron hooks had been driven into the rock. A rotten crate sat collapsed near one wall. Old wire hung from a beam that had no reason to exist in a natural cave. Farther back, half hidden behind mineral stains and dust, a steel door sat set into the stone with a rusted lock hanging from its latch. Above him, Ranger whined once, low and unhappy. Ethan looked up toward the pale shape of the entrance and almost smiled despite himself. "I said stay," he muttered. But the sound had barely left his mouth before 70 pounds of retired military stubbornness began forcing his way down through the shaft. Ranger slid the last few feet awkwardly, landed hard, shook dust from his coat, and moved immediately to Ethan's side, as if nothing about disobeying an order required explanation. Only then did Ethan see the blood on the dog's front paw, a thin red line where sharp stone had opened the pad. "Damn it, Ranger." Ethan knelt, pulled the field kit from his pack, rinsed the cut with bottled water, and wrapped it with gauze, while Ranger stared past him toward the steel door, impatient with care, tolerant of love only when it did not delay work. The wound was shallow, but Ethan's jaw tightened anyway, because Ranger had once crossed worse ground for him, and Ethan hated that the dog still thought he had to. The iron key Samuel left behind fit the lock like it had been waiting there for Ethan's hand. It turned with a dry metallic click, and the door opened inward, with a groan that seemed too loud in the stone chamber. Behind it was not a room exactly, but a small reinforced alcove built into the cave wall, lined with warped boards and old shelving. Ethan's flashlight found a black notebook wrapped in oilcloth, a faded photograph sealed in plastic, and several folded maps tied with twine. The photograph showed Samuel Walker standing inside the same underground chamber years earlier, younger than Ethan remembered, his beard shorter, his eyes brighter, one hand resting on the stream wall as though he had found something sacred and dangerous at the same time. Ethan held the picture longer than he meant to, then opened the notebook. Samuel's handwriting filled the pages in tight, practical lines. Water temperature, airflow direction, seasonal changes, old county survey marks, and references to a Cold War emergency shelter project abandoned before completion. Page after page proved the same thing. Samuel had not been wandering the mountains in madness. He had been documenting a hidden system beneath Cedar Hollow. By late morning, Ethan climbed back out with the notebook, maps, and photographs secured inside his pack, and Ranger followed more carefully this time, though the dog still refused help until his front paws touched the moss above the seam. Sunlight had strengthened a little, but the valley remained cold, and the warm air from below felt even stranger now that Ethan knew what waited beneath it. He sat on a stone near the camp, unwrapped the maps, and studied faded lines that showed natural chambers, old service tunnels, and a larger underground basin marked in Samuel's hand as stable water, no seasonal failure. The phrase repeated in Ethan's mind, while Ranger lay beside him, licking at the edge of the bandage with guilty determination. Ethan was still reading when the sound of a vehicle came slowly up the broken road, cautious over the ruts, too light for a work truck and too careful for someone lost. Maggie Carter stepped out of an aging blue Subaru with a paper pharmacy bag in one hand and Noah's red scarf looped around her wrist. In daylight outside the diner, she looked more tired and more real, auburn hair pulled back beneath a knit cap, cheeks pink from the cold, nurse's coat under an old green jacket, and eyes that carried worry without asking permission to show it. "Noah wouldn't stop talking about the dog who helped him breathe," she said, then looked at Ranger's bandaged paw and frowned in the automatic way of someone who had cleaned wounds before asking who caused them. "And apparently I was right to bring this." She knelt carefully, introduced herself to Ranger before touching him, and opened antiseptic cream, fresh gauze, and a small roll of wrap. Ranger allowed it because Ethan allowed it, though his eyes stayed on the slope. Ethan kept distance at first, answering only what was necessary. But Maggie was not fooled by quiet men. She told him the clinic's funding was nearly gone, that Summit Ridge had been influencing council members by promising tax revenue, and that several families had already signed away land they did not understand because Caleb Whitmore made fear sound like opportunity. Ethan showed her none of the deeper maps, not yet, but he let her see Samuel's photograph and one page of the notebook with the temperature readings. Maggie's expression changed from curiosity to concern. "Samuel tried to tell people something was under this valley," she said softly. Most of town thought grief made him strange after his sister died. Ethan remembered then that Samuel had lost his younger sister, Ethan's mother, to cancer, years before Ethan deployed, and maybe that loss had made the old man turn even harder towards stone, maps, and things that could be measured because people were too easy to lose. Maggie stood and looked toward the ridge. "If Summit Ridge wants this place, there's a reason." Ethan did not answer, but Ranger gave a low rumble, as if he agreed. After Maggie drove back toward town, leaving extra bandages and a warning to keep Ranger's paw clean, Ethan returned to the notebook. Near the middle, beneath a page of airflow measurements, Samuel had written one sentence in darker ink, pressed so hard the words marked the paper beneath it. "If Caleb Whitmore comes back, do not trust any document he brings." Ethan read it twice, then a third time, while the wind moved through Cedar Hollow and Ranger stood slowly, ears lifting toward the lower road. Together they walked back toward the camp, but halfway down the slope, Ranger stopped near a patch of wet red clay just beyond the trees. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud, deep and wide, with an expensive tread pattern that did not match Ethan's truck. The tracks curved toward the ridge, paused near the hidden seam, then turned back. Ethan crouched beside them, touched the cold mud, and felt the morning settle around him with the quiet certainty of a mission beginning. Someone else had been looking for the way in. The rain reached Cedar Hollow after midnight, not as a storm at first, but as a cold mountain drizzle that whispered through the pine needles, darkened the red clay around Ethan's camp, and turned the moss on the black stone shelves into slick green glass. Ethan slept lightly beneath the tarp with his boots beside the bedroll, Samuel's notebook wrapped in oilcloth inside his pack, and the iron key tucked under his jacket, where he could feel its shape when he shifted. Ranger did not sleep the way ordinary dogs slept. The old German shepherd lay at the entrance of the shelter with his bandaged paw stretched forward, his sable coat damp along the shoulders, his whitening muzzle pointed toward the slope, and his amber eyes opening every time the wind changed. At 2:18 a.m., the dog rose without a sound. Ethan woke before Ranger growled, because years beside that, K9 had taught his body to respond to silence before noise. And when the low warning finally rolled through the dog's chest, Ethan already had one hand around the flashlight and the other closing over the field knife near his pack. Through the wet darkness beyond the tarp, 3 beams of light moved between the trees, slow, narrow, and disciplined enough to make Ethan stay still. These were not lost teenagers, hunters, or drunk men daring each other up an old logging road. The figures wore dark rain jackets, black gloves, and headlamps angled low against the fog, and one of them carried a hard equipment case with reflective tape along the edge, while another held a handheld device that blinked blue whenever he pointed it toward the moss-covered seam in the rocks. The third man was older and thicker through the shoulders, his beard cut close, his neck sunk into a black insulated collar, and his posture had the impatient authority of someone used to being obeyed by people, paid by the hour. Ethan studied them from the tarp shadow the way he had once studied movement outside compounds overseas, counting spacing, hands, tools, and roots, while Ranger remained pressed beside him with no command needed, body low, ears forward, the old dog understanding that some threats were best watched before they were challenged. The men stopped near the crack. One crouched and swept a thermal reader across the stone, and even through the rain, Ethan could see the faint glow on the device screen. "Airflows stronger than the lower survey showed," the younger man said, his voice thin and nervous, the kind of voice belonging to someone smart enough to understand danger but not powerful enough to leave it. He was maybe 30, narrow-faced, with a trimmed mustache and city boots already sinking into the clay. The older man snapped, "Just record it." The third, a tall man with a shaved head and a drill case, opened the latch and removed a compact boring unit, no larger than a fence post auger, but too specialized to belong to anyone wandering private mountain land by accident. Then the older man said the name that made Ethan's jaw set. Caleb wants proof before the council hears another complaint. And if that water table is as stable as the Boise report says, Summit Ridge can feed the whole resort without begging the county for access. For a moment, rain on the tarp, Ranger's breath, and Ethan's pulse all seemed to become one sound. Cedar Hollow was not worthless. It was being hunted. Ethan did not move until the men packed their tools and withdrew down the slope, their lights fading into the fog as the engine of a hidden vehicle coughed once somewhere below the road and then disappeared toward town. Only after the valley swallowed them did he stand fully, and Ranger followed him to the crack, limping slightly, but refusing weakness. The rain had softened the clay around the seam, leaving boot prints with clean tread edges, and one small crescent-shaped mark where a metal tripod foot had sunk into the mud. Ethan photographed the tracks with his cracked phone, then covered them loosely with pine branches, the way a man preserved evidence when he did not yet know who could be trusted with it. He went back under the tarp before dawn and opened Samuel's notebook by lantern light, reading the old pages with new eyes. What had sounded like obsession yesterday now sounded like warning, and what the town had called madness began to look more like a man shouting from the far side of money. Morning brought worse news from town. Maggie called just after 9, her voice strained beneath the steady control of a nurse who did not want to frighten a child listening nearby. Noah had been taken to Hartwell Regional after a severe asthma attack before sunrise. The clinic's oxygen supplier had delayed service after funding cuts, and the temporary county grant that kept Maggie's free clinic open had been suspended for review after Summit Ridge's new proposal reached the council. Ethan drove down from Cedar Hollow with Ranger in the passenger seat, the dog's bandaged paw resting carefully on the floor mat, and the town looked smaller under rain, its storefronts dim, its gutters overflowing, its people moving fast with collars up and eyes down. Hartwell Regional was not large, just a 2-story brick hospital at the edge of town with fluorescent halls, tired nurses, and the smell of antiseptic layered over burnt coffee. In room 214, Noah Carter sat upright beneath a thin blanket, pale but breathing easier, his sandy hair damp against his forehead and his blue inhaler on the bedside tray beside a plastic cup of ice chips. Maggie stood near the window when Ethan entered, her auburn hair pulled back unevenly, dark circles under her brown eyes, her nurse's badge clipped to the pocket of a worn cardigan, because she had come as a mother first and a medical worker second. She looked relieved when Ranger stepped inside. Noah did too. The boy's face softened immediately, and Ranger moved to the bed with the slow care of an old soldier approaching a wounded friend, placing his head near Noah's hand without jostling the tubes or the blanket. A respiratory therapist named Paula Jenkins came in a moment later, a short, strong woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair, practical shoes, and the direct kindness of someone who had spent decades telling frightened families the truth without making it cruel. She glanced at Ranger, then at Noah's calmer breathing, and said, "Well, I'm not arguing with whatever works." Maggie almost smiled, then broke enough to admit what she had been carrying. She had thought of leaving Hartwell Falls more than once, taking Noah somewhere with better doctors and steadier money. But if she left, the elderly men who came to the clinic for blood pressure pills, the widows who brought jars of coins for antibiotics, and the veterans who trusted no one else with their shaking hands would have nowhere close to go. That confession stayed with Ethan longer than the hospital smell. He sat quietly while Noah stroked Ranger's fur and asked whether brave dogs ever got scared. And Ethan told him, in a low voice, that brave dogs got scared the same as brave men, but they learned who needed them more than fear did. Maggie listened, without interrupting. Ethan thought of men he had known after deployment, men who could clear a building but could not fill out a benefits form, men who slept in trucks because coming home had turned out to be harder than leaving, men who disappeared from phone lists one missed call at a time. Samuel's hidden donations had not yet been found in this chapter of evidence, but the shape of them seemed to be waiting in the old man's pages, because Samuel had understood neglect in his own mountain language. When Ethan left the hospital, Maggie walked him to the elevator and said quietly, "If Caleb controls the council, he controls what survives in this town." Ethan looked at Ranger, beside him, then back at Maggie. Then we find what Samuel tried to show them. By afternoon, Ethan returned to the underground chamber with a stronger headlamp, extra batteries, and a dry bag for documents. Ranger followed despite the paw, stepping with careful dignity. And Ethan did not order him to stay because some arguments between partners were already decided before they began. Beneath Cedar Hollow, the warm chamber seemed almost peaceful compared to the wet gray world above, the stream moving steadily through stone, the air holding that strange constant temperature. The steel door opened now, like a mouth that had finally spoken. Ethan searched the alcove more thoroughly and found a second metal box behind warped shelving. Inside were letters Samuel had written to the Hartwell Falls Council, water test results from an independent lab in Asheville, and old photographs printed on curled paper showing men in Summit Ridge jackets crossing Cedar Hollow years earlier, before Caleb had ever publicly admitted interest in the valley. One letter, returned unopened, had been addressed to Councilman Robert Hale, a broad, balding man Ethan remembered from campaign posters around town, famous for smiling beside church bake sales and voting whichever way donors blew hardest. Samuel had underlined one sentence in a copy of that letter. This valley is not failed land. It is protected water and shelter, and careless drilling could destroy both. The more Ethan read, the clearer the cruelty became. Samuel had not been ignored because he lacked evidence. He had been ignored because evidence was inconvenient when powerful men wanted cheap land. There were dated photographs of tire tracks, notes about unknown survey crews, a lab report listing clean mineral water with stable readings, and a faded county memo marking an abandoned emergency shelter corridor as inactive, no priority. Ranger sniffed along the back wall while Ethan packed the documents, then stopped near a narrow seam. Ethan had not noticed before, where old air moved faintly behind loose boards. Before he could examine it, a deep sound rolled through the chamber from above. Not thunder, but earth shifting under too much rain. Ethan froze. A second later, rock and mud scraped somewhere near the entrance shaft, and the warm air current snapped into a colder draft. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan grabbed the dry bag and moved toward the rope, but loose stones began falling through the crack, hitting the chamber floor with hard, wet slaps. The entrance had not fully collapsed, but enough of the slope had slid to make climbing out stupid and maybe impossible in the dark. For several minutes, Ethan stood beneath the shaft, listening to rainwater pour through the broken seam while Ranger circled once, nose low, then turned away from the blocked climb, as if the mountain had already told him another route existed. The dog moved toward the loose boards at the rear of the chamber, pawed at them, and gave a low breath through his nose. Ethan pulled them aside and found a narrow ventilation passage reinforced with old rusted brackets, just wide enough for a man to move sideways, and a determined K9 to squeeze through with insulted patience. The passage led 20 feet through damp stone before opening into a larger room, man-made, forgotten, and warmer than the first chamber. Ethan's headlamp swept over stacked crates, folded wool blankets sealed in plastic, dented medical tins, old lanterns, water jugs, and shelves of emergency supplies layered in dust. On a clipboard hanging from a nail was a list of Hartwell Falls families, some names crossed out, some circled, with notes in Samuel's handwriting beside them. Insulin, winter fuel, widow on Mill Road, veteran behind church, Carter Clinic supplies. Ethan stood in the hidden shelter with rain shaking the mountain above him, Ranger breathing beside his leg, and understood that Samuel had not only found a secret under Cedar Hollow, he had been preparing a place for the people the town kept forgetting. By morning, the rain had weakened into a gray mist that clung to Cedar Hollow like breath on glass. But the mountain still sounded unsettled, with water dripping through hidden cracks, clay sliding in slow wet sheets above the blocked entrance, and the underground stream moving steadily past the crates Samuel Walker had stacked with a patience nobody in Hartwell Falls had ever credited to him. Ethan sat on an overturned supply box beneath the warm stone ceiling, Samuel's notebook open across his knees, Ranger lying close enough that his shoulder touched Ethan's boot. The old German shepherd's bandaged paw stretched out and his amber eyes half open, never fully sleeping even in shelter. The room they had found through the ventilation passage no longer looked like a random cache of emergency supplies. Under Ethan's headlamp, it became a system, the blankets wrapped against damp air, the medical tins grouped by date, the water jugs marked in black pen, the food crates logged with names, seasons, and road conditions. Samuel had not simply discovered water. He had designed a fallback position for a town that had forgotten how vulnerable it was when winter cut the roads, when the river rose too fast, or when drought made every well owner suspicious of the next. Ethan spent hours reading the old man's records, and the more he read, the less Cedar Hollow looked like property, and the more it looked like responsibility. Samuel had drawn the valley in layers: surface trails, drainage lines, fractured stone, warm airflow, lower chambers, water channels, and a wide basin marked as stable through freeze, flood, and dry season. He had proposed, in careful handwriting, a community emergency refuge that could shelter elderly residents during ice outages, store clinic supplies when roads washed out, and provide clean water if Hartwell Falls ever faced a long drought. There were copies of letters to the county, grant drafts, hand-drawn evacuation routes, and notes beside certain council names, including Robert Hale, marked with a hard line, and the words, "Changed position after Summit Ridge meeting." Ethan stared at that sentence until the ink seemed to grow darker. He had seen corruption before in more violent forms, but this was quieter, dressed in local politics, coffee meetings, and promises of tax revenue. Summit Ridge had not only ignored Samuel, they had helped make him look unstable so they could wait for his land to become cheap. Maggie helped him get the next door open, not the steel one in the mountain but the human one that Samuel had never managed to force. By early afternoon, after Ethan and Ranger climbed out through the partially cleared seam and drove into town with the documents wrapped in a dry bag, Maggie met them behind the clinic, where rainwater dripped from the rusted gutter, and Noah sat on the back steps with a wool cap pulled low over his sandy hair. Noah was still pale from the hospital, thinner than a 10-year-old should look after one bad night of breathing. But when Ranger stepped from the truck, the boy stood straighter, as if courage arrived on 4 paws. Maggie looked at the maps without speaking at first, her auburn hair tucked under her green jacket hood, her nurse's hands gentle on paper that was older than some of her patients. Then she made a call to Dr. Rebecca Lawson at the University of North Carolina, a woman she knew from a rural health and water quality project years earlier. And the moment Rebecca heard the words stable underground flow and Blue Ridge thermal chamber, her voice changed from polite to alert. Dr. Rebecca Lawson arrived in Hartwell Falls before sunset, in a mud-spattered silver Jeep, carrying 2 sample cases, a rolled survey tube, and the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly how much smarter facts were than powerful men. She was 44, tall, lean, and sharp-featured, with dark curly hair streaked lightly with gray, brown skin weathered from fieldwork, and clear, intelligent eyes that missed very little. She dressed practically: hiking pants, waterproof boots, a canvas jacket, and a university badge tucked into one pocket, but she carried herself with a directness that made people stand straighter without being ordered to. Years of studying water systems across the Blue Ridge had made her skeptical of exaggerated claims, and years of being talked over in county rooms had made her patient in the dangerous way, the kind that waited until evidence became impossible to dismiss. She examined Samuel's maps on the clinic table, while Ethan, Maggie, Noah, and Ranger watched. Then she opened the water sample Ethan had taken from the chamber stream, ran a quick field test, compared temperatures, mineral notes, and Samuel's old readings, and finally looked up with an expression that made the room go quiet. "This is not a fantasy," she said. "If these readings are accurate, Cedar Hollow is sitting over a rare, stable water system, and if someone drills into the wrong fracture, they could collapse part of the chamber, contaminate the flow, or destabilize the slope above the homes downstream." Noah did not understand every word, but he understood danger when adults stopped pretending. He moved closer to Ranger, one hand resting in the thick fur behind the dog's neck, and for the first time since Ethan had met him, the boy did not look away when he asked a question. "Were you scared when you went down there?" Ethan looked at him, then at Ranger, who leaned his heavy body gently against Noah's leg, the way he had leaned against wounded men after loud nights overseas. Ethan could have told a story about missions, firefights, or tunnels under foreign villages, but those belonged to the dead and to men who still woke hearing them. Instead, he said quietly, "Courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you still do the right thing while you are scared." Maggie looked at him then, really looked, as if a door had opened in a man she had thought was built only from silence. Noah nodded slowly, holding the words like something he might need later. And Ranger gave one soft breath through his nose, patient as stone. Caleb Whitmore began pushing before Rebecca even finished her first written statement. The next morning, a courier delivered an envelope to Ethan at the clinic, heavy cream paper, legal letterhead, and language polished enough to hide a threat without making it disappear. The letter accused Ethan of entering unregistered underground structures, removing materials relevant to development assessment, and creating geological liability by disturbing Cedar Hollow, without proper survey authority. Attached was a new offer from Summit Ridge Development, 20 times larger than Caleb's first insult in Harold Bennett's office, generous enough to tempt a desperate man, urgent enough to expose fear. The attorney signing the letter was Marissa Cole, a slim, severe woman from Asheville, with silver-rimmed glasses and a reputation, Maggie said, for making small towns feel poor before a judge ever entered the room. Ethan read the offer once, folded it, and placed it beside Samuel's notebook. They raised the price because they know what's under it, Rebecca said. Ethan nodded. Caleb had stopped pretending Cedar Hollow was worthless. That afternoon, pressure turned physical. Ethan returned to the valley with Ranger and found the camp torn apart, his tarp slashed, the bedroll dragged through mud, the supply box opened, and the truck windshield cracked in a spiderweb pattern across the passenger side. Whoever had searched the camp had known what they wanted, because nothing valuable was missing except the decoy notebook Ethan had left in plain sight, an empty cover filled with blank paper and old grocery receipts, after Ranger had growled at the lower road that morning, and Ethan's instincts had told him to protect the real documents elsewhere. Still, the violation sat cold in the air. Ranger circled the camp with his nose down, moving stiffly on the healing paw, then stopped near the torn tarp and lifted a strip of black fabric caught on a broken branch. Ethan crouched beside him. The fabric was expensive, waterproof, torn from a sleeve, and dotted with a smear of fresh blood where Ranger must have caught the intruder before the man got free. "Good boy," Ethan said softly, though his voice carried no warmth for whoever had come there. Ranger looked toward the trees, ears raised, as if the man's scent still hung among them. Ethan brought the fabric and blood smear to Sheriff Laura Mitchell just before dusk. Laura was 46, broad-shouldered, compact, and steady, with short gray-blonde hair, sun-browned skin, and a face that looked tired from saying no to men who expected yes. She had served Hartwell County for nearly 20 years and had the guarded manner of someone who knew the law was only as strong as the proof in her hand and the courage of the people willing to stand behind it. She did not like Caleb. That much showed in the way her mouth tightened when Ethan said his name, but she also did not pretend suspicion was enough. "You give me proof of illegal entry, vandalism, or drilling, and I can move," she said, sealing the fabric in an evidence bag. Until then, Summit Ridge's lawyers will call this a property dispute, and half the council will nod like trained dogs. Ranger sat beside Ethan's chair, watching Laura with careful approval, and for a moment the sheriff almost smiled. "That dog looks like he believes more in evidence than people," she said. Ethan looked down at Ranger's scarred muzzle. "He's usually right." The proof came through Samuel's maps and Rebecca's science, faster than Ethan expected. That night, as rain began again over Hartwell Falls, Rebecca overlaid Samuel's old chamber drawings with modern county survey grids, while Maggie kept Noah busy in the clinic break room and Ranger rested near the door with one ear aimed toward every hallway sound. One red-marked fracture line on Samuel's map matched a parcel access route Summit Ridge had recently requested for soil stability review. Rebecca traced it with her pencil, then stopped. "If they drill here," she said, tapping the paper, "they are not just sampling, they are punching almost directly above the chamber roof." Ethan leaned closer. "Would it collapse?" Rebecca's answer came without drama, which made it worse. "It could. At minimum, it could open contamination into the water flow. At worst, it brings down part of the slope." Maggie stepped into the room in time to hear the last sentence, and all the color left her face, because downstream from Cedar Hollow were homes, the clinic road, and the low section of town where people who could not afford higher ground lived. Near midnight, Ethan returned to Cedar Hollow alone with Ranger, his shoulder aching from clearing debris and climbing the seam too many times, the joint swollen beneath his jacket after a slip on wet stone earlier that day, but still usable if he kept the movement low and controlled. He did not tell Maggie he was going back because she would have wanted to come, And he did not tell Laura, because without active proof she could not stop a machine that had not yet arrived. The valley lay black beneath rolling fog, but near the lower access road, Ethan saw fresh tracks pressed into the mud, wider than pickups, heavier than survey vehicles, leading toward a flat shelf above the chamber line. He killed the truck lights and watched from the trees while two men unloaded covered equipment from a trailer under red work lamps. One of them spoke into a phone, and Ethan heard Caleb's name carried thinly through the wet air, followed by the words, "before the council meeting." Ranger stood beside him, body rigid, lips barely lifted over his teeth. Ethan looked from the hidden chamber beneath the ridge to the drilling position above it, then tightened his grip on the rope bag with his good hand. If Caleb started before morning, Cedar Hollow might lose the one thing Samuel had spent his life protecting, and Ethan understood, with the old cold clarity of a mission beginning, that he and Ranger were the only ones close enough to stop it. The storm reached Cedar Hollow like something that had crossed the Blue Ridge with a grudge, pushing cold rain through the pine crowns, bending the laurel branches low over the old logging road, and turning the red clay under Ethan Walker's boots into slick mud that tried to pull every step backward. The valley no longer looked forgotten. It looked awake. Fog moved between the black stone shelves in torn white sheets. Water ran down the slopes in crooked lines, and somewhere beneath all of it, below moss and fractured rock and the hidden chambers Samuel had mapped by hand, the underground stream kept moving with the same steady patience that had outlasted men, money, and every lie told about Cedar Hollow. Ethan crouched in the tree line with Ranger pressed beside his left leg, the old German shepherd's sable coat darkened by rain, his bandaged paw planted carefully in the mud, his amber eyes fixed on the red work lamps, glowing near the slope. Ethan's shoulder ached deep from the earlier climb, a hot grinding pain under the jacket, but he kept his breathing slow because pain was information, not permission to stop. Below the ridge shelf, Caleb Whitmore's crew had already begun unloading equipment from a covered trailer, the machinery half hidden beneath tarps, stamped with Summit Ridge subcontractor marks. A portable generator rattled under the rain, cables snaked across the mud, and a compact drilling rig sat on sled tracks aimed toward the fractured stone above the chamber roof, exactly where Dr. Rebecca Lawson had warned one mistake could bring the mountain down into its own water. Caleb stood under a black umbrella held by one of his men, untouched by the weather in his long charcoal raincoat, his silver-streaked hair slicked back, his face calm in the insulting way of a man who believed danger belonged to other people. Near him, a foreman named Dale Mercer barked instructions at the crew, a square-built man in his early 50s, with a thick neck, a rain-silvered beard, and tired eyes that suggested he had spent a lifetime taking jobs he disliked because bills did not care about conscience. Two younger workers moved around him with nervous energy, one checking hoses and one tightening bolts, both glancing often at the unstable slope, as if their bodies understood what their paychecks had asked them to ignore. Ethan kept to the old deer trail above them, using the darkness and the storm the way training had taught him to use any bad condition that hurt both sides equally, while Ranger moved without command, low and silent, choosing ground that would not slide. In town, Maggie Carter was already calling Sheriff Laura Mitchell, sending photos of the legal threat, the vandalized camp, Rebecca's annotated maps, and the coordinates Ethan had texted before leaving the clinic. Maggie was not on the ridge yet, not when Ethan first moved into position. She was at the clinic with Noah, trying to keep her voice, even while fear worked through her ribs. But Ethan knew her well enough now to know she would not stay behind if she believed someone she cared about was about to walk into harm. Laura had answered with the same hard patience she carried into every fight with men protected by lawyers, telling Maggie that she needed visible proof of illegal drilling before she could make charges stick, and that she was coming with Rebecca as fast as mountain roads allowed. The drill motor coughed once, then caught, and the vibration moved through the ground so faintly at first that only Ranger reacted. The dog's head snapped toward the stone, ears forward, body rigid, a low growl rising from his chest before the human ear could decide the sound beneath the generator was wrong. Ethan stood then, stepping out from the timber with his flashlight raised high, the beam cutting across rain and catching Caleb, Dale, Mercer, and the workers in a hard white glare. "Shut it down," Ethan called, his voice low but carrying through the storm. The workers froze. Dale turned first, hand half raised against the light. Caleb only smiled, as if Ethan's arrival had completed a scene he had already rehearsed. "Mr. Walker," he said, rain tapping against the umbrella above him, "you're trespassing in a work zone on land that is under active environmental assessment." Ethan walked closer, Ranger beside him with teeth just visible under the storm light. "No," Ethan said. "You have visual survey permission pending review. You do not have drilling clearance. Shut it down." Base. Caleb stepped out from under the umbrella then, letting rain touch his coat for the first time, as if the gesture made him braver. "You were a soldier once," he said, loud enough for the crew to hear. "Maybe that makes you good in a fight, but it does not make you a geologist, a planner, or a man who knows what land is worth. Cedar Hollow will have value when it belongs to people who understand how to use it." Ethan looked past him at the drill head settling against the wet stone. "Samuel understood it," he said. Caleb's smile thinned. Samuel was an old man living in tunnels and writing warnings nobody needed. The insult hit the air, and for a second even Dale Mercer looked away. Ranger growled harder. Caleb's eyes flicked toward the dog, then back to Ethan. "Call him off before someone gets hurt." Ethan did not look down. "Someone already will if that rig starts." The young worker at the control panel hesitated, but Dale Mercer, trapped between Caleb's order and the fear in his own face, gave a short nod toward the machine. The drill began to turn. At once, the vibration under the mud changed from mechanical to structural. A deeper answering tremor, moving through the fractured shelf like something old, clearing its throat. Ranger lunged forward before Ethan could speak. Not toward Caleb, not toward the drill, but toward the worker, standing closest to the slope edge. A thin young man named Trevor Mills, maybe 26, with rain-plastered blonde hair and wide, frightened eyes. Trevor had one boot planted on a patch of clay that began to sink while he stared at the drill head. Ranger hit him hard in the side, grabbed the sleeve of his rain jacket in his teeth, and dragged backward with a violent twist, just as the ground where Trevor had stood collapsed into a slurry of mud, stone, and brown water. Everything happened at once after that. The drill sled dropped nearly 2 feet on one side. The generator screamed. A hose snapped loose and whipped through the rain, and dirty water burst from a new crack in the stone, spraying upward in a muddy fan that smelled of minerals and broken earth. Dale Mercer shouted for the crew to kill power, but one worker slipped near the rig, his leg pinned under a shifting support bar as the slope groaned beneath him. Ethan moved without thinking about the shoulder. He threw the rope around a pine trunk, clipped the end through the harness loop still hanging from his pack, and slid down the mud on one knee, pain flashing white across his collarbone as he reached the trapped man. The worker was older than Trevor, broad-faced, dark-skinned, and terrified, his name patch reading Ellis. Ethan locked the rope around Ellis's chest, shouted for him to hold, then leaned back with every ounce of strength his injured body could still give while Dale and Trevor, shaken into decency by fear, grabbed the line and pulled. Headlights cut through the trees behind them, then another set, and Maggie appeared at the ridge edge, with Noah half hidden behind her raincoat, before Ethan could understand how she had reached them so fast. Noah had disobeyed her, or followed her, or simply refused to wait at the clinic while Ranger and Ethan were in danger, and his small face was pale under the hood of his jacket, his breathing already tight from the cold, wet air. Ranger saw him at the same moment the slope shifted again. A slab of wet stone slid loose from above the rig, not large enough to bury the crew, but fast enough to strike the place where Noah stood frozen beside a rotted stump. Ranger broke from Trevor, crossed the mud in 3 bounding strides, and slammed his body between Noah and the sliding rock, knocking the boy backward into Maggie's arms, while the edge of the stone caught Ranger along the ribs. The dog yelped once, sharp and raw, then stayed on his feet. That sound changed Ethan more than the collapse did. He got Ellis free, dragged him clear, then stumbled toward Ranger through rain that had turned the work lamps into blurred halos. Maggie was on her knees with Noah pressed against her chest, whispering for him to breathe slowly, stay with me, while Noah clutched Ranger's wet fur with shaking fingers. Ranger stood over them, bleeding lightly beneath the shoulder, his old body trembling from impact, but his eyes still fixed on the slope. Ethan dropped beside him, one hand moving over the dog's ribs with a care that did not match the violence around them. "Easy, buddy," he said, voice rough now. "I got you." Ranger leaned into him for half a second, not collapsing, not asking, just allowing Ethan to hold some of the weight he had carried for years. Sheriff Laura Mitchell arrived through the mud with 2 deputies behind her, rain running off the brim of her hat, her jaw set hard enough to make every worker step back without being told. Doctor. Rebecca Lawson followed in a yellow field jacket, tall and sharp-eyed under the storm hood, carrying a waterproof case and a tablet already lit with Samuel's map overlay. Laura took in the rig, the cracked slope, the burst water, the injured workers, Caleb's face, Ranger's blood, and Ethan's rope, still tied to Ellis before saying a single word. Then she turned to Dale Mercer. Who authorized drilling? Dale looked at Caleb first, and that small movement did more damage than any speech. Trevor, still shaking, spoke before Dale could protect anyone. Mr. Whitmore said it had to be done before the preservation filing, he said, voice breaking under rain and fear. He said if we got waterproof tonight, the council couldn't stop the project. Caleb snapped his name, but Laura had already heard enough. Rebecca crouched near the damaged drill position and pointed her light into the widening fracture, where muddy water pulsed in rhythm with the unseen flow beneath Cedar Hollow. This site is unstable, she said clearly for the deputy's camera. Continued drilling could have collapsed the upper chamber and contaminated the water channel. Laura's younger deputy, Aaron Pike, a lean red-haired man in his early 30s with rain on his glasses and the careful expression of someone new enough to still believe procedure could save lives, recorded the equipment labels, Summit Ridge documents, maps, and the crew's statements. The second deputy moved toward Caleb. Caleb tried one more polished sentence about misunderstandings, assessments, and economic opportunity, but the words sounded small under the mountain's low groan. Laura read him the temporary charges for unlawful entry, reckless endangerment, environmental violation, and obstruction of a pending county review. And when the cuffs closed around his wrists, he finally stopped smiling. By the time emergency lights painted the wet trees red and blue, most of Hartwell Falls already knew something had happened at Cedar Hollow. Phones rang from porch to porch. The diner owner heard from a deputy's wife. The hospital heard from Maggie. And by midnight, the story had begun moving through town faster than the stormwater in the ditches. Caleb's crew had drilled where they were not allowed. The mountain had nearly collapsed. A veteran had pulled one man out. Ranger, the old war dog with a white muzzle and bandaged paw, had saved a worker and shielded a sick child from falling stone. Ethan did not care about that part yet. He sat on the wet ground near the tree line with Ranger's head against his thigh, Maggie wrapping gauze around the shallow cut along the dog's ribs, while Noah sat close enough to touch Ranger's paw and breathe with him, slow and steady. Ethan looked down at the dog who had followed him through war, through silence, through truck stops and bad nights, and into a valley everyone else had thrown away, and he understood with painful clarity that Ranger had not only saved other people in Cedar Hollow. Day by day, without asking credit, the dog had been leading Ethan back toward the living. Near dawn, after Caleb had been driven down the mountain and the rig stood silent under sheriff tape, Ethan looked across the ruined slope and saw townspeople's trucks gathering below the access road, their headlights glowing in the mist like cautious stars. Laura spoke with Rebecca near the fracture. Maggie held Noah under a blanket. Ranger slept at last against Ethan's boot. The rain softened. Beneath the broken stone, warm water still moved through the hidden chambers Samuel had protected, and for the first time, Cedar Hollow did not feel like land waiting to be bought or buried. It felt like proof. By morning, everyone in Hartwell Falls would understand what Samuel had tried to tell them, and what Ethan had nearly died proving. Cedar Hollow was not dead ground. It was a place that could save them. By the time spring reached Cedar Hollow, the mountain no longer looked like the place Hartwell Falls had once laughed about in diner booths and courthouse hallways. Because the broken logging road had been cleared just enough for county trucks, the collapsed shelf above the hidden chamber had been braced with steel anchors under Dr. Rebecca Lawson's supervision, and yellow warning tape had been replaced by cedar posts carrying simple signs that said, Community Conservation Area, Supervised Access Only, no drilling, no commercial extraction. The storm night had changed everything. Summit Ridge Development lost its claim before it ever became legal ownership. Caleb Whitmore's polished name began appearing in financial investigation reports instead of ribbon-cutting announcements, and the same men who once called Samuel Walker a mountain fool now stood quiet when Rebecca opened his notebooks at public meetings and showed, line by line, that the old miner had understood the valley better than every consultant who had tried to buy it. Ethan Walker never said much in those meetings. He sat near the back with Ranger at his boot, broad shoulders still guarded, steel blue eyes watchful, one hand resting on the German shepherd's scarred neck. While other people finally learned to respect the dead man's map, Ethan did not sell Cedar Hollow. Not when the county offered a purchase arrangement, not when conservation groups asked whether ownership should be transferred, and not when one remaining Summit Ridge attorney suggested quietly that a private settlement could make him comfortable for life. Instead, he signed a community preservation agreement that kept the land in his name but placed the water system, the caves, and the emergency shelter under joint oversight by Hartwell County, the university team, and a small veterans organization from Asheville that understood quiet places better than publicity. Hollow Haven began with nothing grand, only a folding table, a legal file, Samuel's notebooks, Maggie Carter's clinic records, Rebecca's geological maps, and Sheriff Laura Mitchell's evidence photos from the illegal drilling night. Laura, still broad-shouldered, gray-blonde, and blunt as a fence post, insisted the rules be written before anyone cut a ribbon. No tours without supervision, no groups larger than 8, no cameras underground without approval, no touching the water channels, no speeches about profit. Rebecca agreed, Maggie agreed, and Ethan agreed before anyone finished asking, because Cedar Hollow had already survived too many men who thought discovery meant possession. The first structure built above the valley was not a visitor center. It was a small cabin near the safer lower trail, 12 by 18 feet, cedar-sided, tin-roofed, plain enough to disappear into the pines when fog moved in. Ethan built most of it himself, slow at first because his shoulder still burned when he lifted too high, and Ranger slept nearby through the hammering, his sable coat warmer in the sun, his whitening muzzle resting on his paws, his ears lifting every time a truck came up the road. Maggie came on weekends with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and medical supplies, sorted into labeled bins for the underground shelter, her auburn hair usually tied beneath a cap, her brown eyes softer now, but still carrying the alert kindness of a woman who had learned to recognize pain before people named it. Noah came with her, stronger after the winter, still narrow-shouldered and careful with cold air, but no longer shrinking from the world, as much as he had before. He followed Ranger along the trail with slow trust, learning where the rock was slick, where the warm air rose, and where to stop and listen for water moving under stone. Hollow Haven grew the way honest things grow in small towns, not through announcements but through use. Maggie's clinic stayed open after the Cedar Hollow story drew donations from churches, veterans groups, and families who remembered Samuel's quiet help when winter bills had once almost broken them. The county restored oxygen service, the pharmacy extended credit, and an old retired carpenter replaced the clinic's back steps after hearing Noah tell someone that Ranger had saved him from the mountain. Ethan repaired the clinic roof one Saturday without being asked, working in silence while Maggie held the ladder below and pretended not to notice when he winced through the shoulder pain. Later, he took Noah fishing at a shallow creek below the valley, not because he knew what to say to a boy who had been frightened by his own lungs, but because silence beside water could teach what men failed to explain. Noah asked about courage again, and Ethan did not add a speech. He only showed the boy how to cast, watched Ranger settle between them like a guard on duty, and said that courage sometimes looked like trying again after your body had already taught you to be afraid. Dr. Rebecca Lawson returned every other week with graduate students and monitoring equipment, but she never treated Cedar Hollow like a classroom owned by the university. She was still sharp, direct, and impossible to impress with politics. Her dark curls streaked with gray beneath a field hat, her boots usually muddy before noon, her voice calm when she explained how careless drilling could have killed the water system forever. Under her guidance, safe platforms were installed near the first chamber, the ventilation passage was reinforced, and Samuel's supply room became a real emergency cache with updated medicine, blankets, radios, and water filters. Ranger learned the new route faster than the engineers did. He walked ahead of small groups, paused where the floor changed, and looked back when someone lagged behind, as if the old K9 had accepted a new mission that did not involve war, but still required watchfulness. Some visitors came nervous, especially veterans, who had no patience for therapy rooms, but could sit for an hour beside underground water without explaining themselves, and Ethan began to understand that Samuel had not hidden from town because he hated people. He had hidden a place that might heal them when they were ready. The final pages of Samuel's notebook appeared one evening in May, when Ethan cleaned the old supply crate that had been used as a table in the second chamber. A thin packet had been taped beneath the wooden lip, wrapped in wax paper, and marked with Ethan's name in Samuel's hard, slanted handwriting. Ethan opened it inside the cabin after dark, while rain tapped softly on the tin roof, and Ranger lay beside the stove, with his ribs fully healed, though one rear leg had begun to stiffen on cold mornings. Maggie sat across from Ethan at the small table, not speaking, only present, which had become the way she helped him most. The final note was not long. Samuel wrote that he had left Cedar Hollow to Ethan not because Ethan needed land, but because Ethan needed a place that would not ask him to explain why he still woke like danger was nearby. He wrote that broken places, old dogs, frightened boys, stubborn nurses, and men who came home carrying too much were often called difficult, useless, or dangerous by people who did not have patience to look deeper. Then he wrote one last line that made Ethan set the paper down and close his eyes. "You will know what to do with the valley, because you know what it means to survive under pressure." Daniel Walker came up the road near the end of that same week, driving an old white Ford with a cracked windshield and a toolbox rattling in the bed. Daniel was Ethan's cousin by blood, and almost a brother by childhood. 43 years old, broad like most Walker men, with sun-reddened skin, sandy hair cut short, a permanent squint from years of outdoor work, and a guarded, stubborn face that made apology look harder than labor. He and Ethan had drifted apart after Ethan returned from overseas, partly because Daniel had believed the ugly rumors that Ethan wanted nothing to do with family, and partly because Ethan had let silence answer for him too many times. Daniel stepped from the truck, wearing a faded work shirt and muddy boots, looked at the cabin, the trail signs, Maggie's clinic supply boxes, Noah sitting with Ranger near the porch, and the valley beyond them, then lifted an old wooden toolbox from the truck bed. "Found these in Samuel's shed," he said, voice rough. "Figured they belonged here." Inside were Samuel's hammer, measuring square, rust-spotted chisels, and carpenter pencils, worn nearly flat. Ethan took the box without a speech, because some mountain men only knew how to cross distance by carrying something useful across it. They repaired the porch steps together before sunset. Daniel held boards. Ethan drove nails. Noah handed screws when asked, proud to be included, and Ranger lay where he could watch all four of them at once. No apology came, not in the way movies would have wanted, but halfway through the work Daniel cleared his throat and said, "I should have come sooner," and Ethan, after a long moment, answered, "You're here now." That was enough for the evening. Maggie watched from the doorway with one shoulder against the frame, and something in her face told Ethan she understood exactly what had just happened, even if no one else would have heard it. When Daniel left, the steps held firm under his boots, and Ethan stood on the porch listening to the truck fade down the road, while the valley settled into blue dusk, and the underground water moved beneath them, steady and unseen. The last morning of the story came softly, with no helicopter dream tearing Ethan awake, no hand reaching for a weapon that was not there, no cold panic in his ribs before his eyes opened. Pale spring light entered the cabin window facing the lower valley, and the wood stove had burned down to red embers that clicked quietly in the ash. Ranger slept beside it with his silvered muzzle resting on Samuel's old work gloves, the old dog breathing slow, his body scarred but peaceful, his duty finally softened into belonging. Ethan sat up on the cot and listened. Wind through pine branches. A faint bird call. Water moving somewhere deep below the floorboards. Beneath stone. Beneath old fear. Beneath every wrong name people had given this valley. Outside, Maggie and Noah were on the porch, hanging the cedar sign. Noah had helped sand smooth, the letters carved by Ethan's careful hand. Some places are not empty, they are waiting. Maggie looked back at him through the open door and smiled, not like someone saving him, not like someone asking him to become another man, but like someone willing to stand beside the one who had survived. Ethan stepped onto the porch with a chipped coffee mug in his hand, Ranger rising slowly to follow and settling beside Noah without command. Below them, Cedar Hollow stretched green and gold in the first full warmth of spring. The old red clay road repaired just enough, the protected trail leading toward the chamber entrance, the clinic supply truck waiting near the lower gate, and the town beyond the trees beginning to understand that usefulness had never belonged only to land that could be sold. Maggie touched the sign once to straighten it. Noah leaned against Ranger, breathing easily in the morning air. Ethan looked across the valley Samuel had guarded, the valley Caleb had tried to steal. The valley people had called useless because they had never stayed long enough to listen, and for the first time in years, he did not feel like a man passing through somebody else's world. He felt the quiet weight of home. Not perfect, not painless, but real, with warm water moving under cold stone and an old K9 at his side. And he knew Cedar Hollow had been waiting for all of them. And maybe this is the lesson Cedar Hollow was trying to teach us all along. Sometimes God hides the greatest miracles in the places people call useless, broken, forgotten, or too far gone to save. Ethan thought he had inherited worthless land, but God had placed beneath that cold stone a living stream, a shelter, a purpose, and a path back to life. Ranger was not just a loyal dog walking beside a wounded Navy SEAL. He was a quiet reminder that God often sends help in humble forms, through a faithful friend, a brave animal, a kind nurse, a frightened child, or an old notebook left behind by someone who believed before anyone else did. In our daily lives, we may also look at ourselves, our families, our struggles, or our failures, and think there is nothing valuable left there. But God sees deeper than the surface. He sees the water still moving beneath the stone. He sees the courage still alive beneath the fear. He sees the home waiting inside the heart that has been running for too long. So if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with the word Amen if you believe God can turn forgotten places into places of healing, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, loyalty, courage, and redemption. May God bless you. Protect your family. Heal the wounds you do not speak about. Guide your steps through every dark valley, and remind you that no life is useless when it is still held in His hands.